Today, in the place that more than any other brings together global power and purpose for dialogue, I address you with the manifest intention of sowing perceptions and reasonings on which to structure pragmatic agreements for a new phase of human progress. Granted me the privilege of complete autonomy in choosing the topic, it was inevitable that it would focus, to a large extent, on the subject of influence, not only because of the objectivity of the contingencies I will present to you, but also because of the origin of the perceptions on which I have founded my entire business apparatus. I have always been fascinated by the subject of influence. I remember that, as a young man, I was enthralled by the idea that a single man, through mere dialectical artifices, had been able to contain an entire crowd of rioters. I am referring to the famous speech by Menenius Agrippa, who from the Aventine Hill pacified a mass of subversives in what we might, with historical license, define as an antelitteram strike uprising. I also remember the complexity of the reflections that my still acerbic intellect had to face when the epiphany of a connection between the sophists and the sedimentation of democracy struck hard at the foundations of my social naivety. My early studies in political science were followed by an entrepreneurial activity that drew its lymph from the ability to dialogue. As the volume of business I conducted increased, so did my incredulity in the behavioral ability that determined its successes. I quickly sensed that a practical mastery of the dynamics underlying these weaknesses would constitute a formidable advantage, and that this advantage would, in turn, give me control over the ethics of every transaction. I identified cognitive neuroscience as the knowledge on which I would build my new set of skills. The fusion with this new knowledge was exciting. It ignited a spark that in an instant made me a leading figure in scientific research on the neurocorrelates of human consciousness. It was from that same spark that neuroinductive practice was born, the most modern paradigm of advanced influence skills for application in business, and with it, the foundation of all my accomplishments with the Lugli Group. I like to think of the evolution of my intellect as similar to the long journey of surprises and awareness that led human beings to move from naive observation of nature to the creation of the first stratagems, to the substructures that gave rise to science and its innumerable applications. Beyond all the romanticism on which I base this complacency, I can tell you with a good dose of realism that the progress of my knowledge has fostered a multifaceted perspective on human behavior, such that it privileged me with the effortlessness of analyzing its workings in their biologically determined qualities, and at the same time inserted into its social-cultural evolution. The advantages of this intermingling are vast and extend, often in counterintuitive ways, to every context of life. Suffice it to mention how the neuroscientific assumption that all brains function in the same way has facilitated the dismantling of any social barriers in my business negotiations, favoring a cross-cultural approach which in turn has formed the conceptual basis for the geographical expansion of the Lugli Group. The step from a transcultural vision to foresight is immediate when historical events are sifted through the mesh of human behavior, suggesting that not only all brains function in the same way, but that they always have. Even the most prosaic debates reveal their timelessness. It is sufficient to contrast the fervent arguments about the figures paid to athletes, the exorbitance of which is commonly attributed to modern times, with the story of Gaius Apuleius Diocles, a Roman charioteer who in the 2nd century AD accumulated enough wealth to finance the entire Roman army at its peak for 2 months. Although even the sloppiest manifestations reveal their very distinct constants, it is in the behavioral levers through which the protagonist of history rose to power that my argument achieves the gravitas worthy of this whole. It is in these levers that the constant of the irrational is unequivocally revealed, omnipresent in human expressions, and a fertile basis on which human beings have gradually perfected all means of influence, even over multitudes of their own kind. Julius Caesar presents himself to the Roman people as a descendant of Venus, associating his name with the myth of her son Aeneas, who, exiled from Troy, lands on the Tyrrhenian coast and founds the settlement on which the eternal city will rise. Augustus, his nephew and heir, will deify him, becoming semi-divine himself, and definitively mantling the gens Julia with myth. The Arapaches is one of the most striking propaganda manifestos of this divine movement. Louis XIV, among his very first acts after assuming absolute power over the government, calls to court Charpentier, a composer skilled in sacred vocal music, Chapelain, the founding poet of the French Academy, and Perrault, known as the father of children's literature, author of Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Tom Thumb, Puss in Boots, and many other fairy tales. The task was clear. I entrust to you the thing in the world that is most dear to me, my glory. It was at that moment that the sun began its ascent to its zenith. The most reticent will doubt the constant, that is the present value, that has been desired to be explicit. Although an exposition on the hundreds of mythical, transcendental powers would cement the concept even in the most skeptical minds, suffice it to say that for almost 2100 years, thousands of visitors lay roses on the spot where Caesar fell, preserving the violent color of the instant that immortalized the myth. With the respect guaranteed by the impartiality of the descripted purpose, I also mentioned that at least 2 of the members of the G10 of the last decade have claimed to be anointed by God and to be direct intermediaries of God in the exercise of their power. Indeed, exceptions throughout human history are extremely rare, and being devoid of transcendence and myth, absent from the collective imagination. Mention should be made, above all, of Frederick II of Swabia. In his Generalis Lictera, he performed the revolutionary act of declaring that nobility could be acquired not only by birth, but also through study and knowledge. This was in 1224 AD. More than 50 years of action as emperor of the Holy Roman Empire were not enough for him, nor was the megalomania of proclaiming himself stupor mundi, wonder of the world, to consolidate himself as a legend. He was the wonder of this world alone and of no other. With influence afflicting the precarious rationality of civilizations and eras, and indeed constituting a fundamental element of it, it is appropriate to reflect on the systems and the ideals that this precariousness has transmitted to contemporaneity. In economic systems, the idea of the human being as a rational decision maker based on the erroneous premise of his unlimited capacity to process information is already yielding to the conception of individuals significantly fatigued by the complexity of combining present action with even the most intimate long-term interest. This results in the subjugation of analysis of individual economic movements to the constatation that as the complexity of decision increases, so does the irrationality of their outcomes. This cognitive narrowness abandons transactional dynamics to the mercy of a game of heuristics and perceptions, in which the influence of emotional factors and the behavior of others constitute the lever on which any sales, negotiation, and leadership dynamic is based. The ideal of equality on which democratic systems and sometimes corporations are modeled is subverted when it's governed by the belief that the exchange of multiple experiences aimed at common goals constitutes the basis for the enrichment of knowledge and consequently the best outcome. When analyzed through the prism of human behavior, this decision-making process is impoverished by a tangle of mutual influences, resulting in groups tending to consider only information common to all members, if assimilated. Negligence in sharing unique individual resources leads to a leveling of knowledge corresponding to the common level of understanding, that is, inferior to the ensemble of the individual specific skills that represent the ideal richness of the group. Although an abandonment to the emphasis of the argument would lead me to the exasperation of an endless array of facts and dynamics, it is not my immediate intention to analyze exhaustively the structures on which civilizations are built, much less to discuss alternative systems to those described, or worse, to suggest utopias of rationality. Rather, having shared evidence on the depth to which influence is grafted onto omnipresent irrationality and on how power, systems, and ideals flow from it, I intend to reveal that knowledge about behavior has been advanced at a relentless pace for decades. That this pace, corroborated by technological advances, marks the emergence of an immeasurable gap between academic knowledge and popular awareness, and that this knowledge has a direct bearing on all the nuances of civilized life. I have privileged cognition of the extent of the discrepancy in question, because I have built my entire body of economic activity on it. Among all of them, the neuromarketing protocols of the Lugli Group explicitly demonstrate this commitment and the distance it symbolizes from traditional knowledge. As pioneers in the integration of high technology, cognitive neuroscience, and economics, we are able to identify and, above all, quantify the neural processes responsible for the association between pleasure, reward, and perception. Our results guide corporations in the development of the characteristics of their consumer goods, tracing any forecast regarding market acceptance to predefined intervals of statistical confidence. As knowledge about human behavior advances, the contingency of the advance of computer knowledge is presented in an osmosis that is counterintuitive to most, in which computer and neuroscientific progress invigorate each other. From this contingency stem civil implications of extreme significance. If the pace of progress in knowledge about human behavior already renders it increasingly isolated from common knowledge, it is largely through this that the ramification of digital presence and its penetration into every facet of human daily life thrive. In this B-University lies the most powerful instrument of influence in human history. Just over 50 years ago, religious representatives of one of the most culturally advanced countries, in electoral support of a specific party, gifted the less privileged with one single shoe, with the promise of a second one once the victory of the referred politician was confirmed. Today, electoral preference is imposed digitally, insinuating itself into a sequence of dopamine rushes whose continuity gains increasing strength from the intimate fragility of human beings, in their irrational desire to find constant confirmation of their worldview. The most evolved beast on the planet is isolated and surrendered to its own weaknesses. This powerful medium of influence radiates into the lives of individuals whose heterogeneity is hardly grasped by the power, by those responsible who, even with honesty of spirit, are charged with drafting the rules and systems that sustain societies. I am talking about the global north, where the population, although on average more educated, does not always demonstrate clarity on the age-old distinction between astrology and astronomy. But I am also talking about the global south, which for some decades has been addressing its pleas for globalized access to the digital ramification that will encounter a population in which individuals, for thievery, may succumb to the impulse to kill baldmen, driven by the conviction that gold can be found under their scalps, where individuals infected with AIDS may rape virgin women, in the firm conviction that the act will cure them of the disease, and who, having ascertained its progression of the first violation, turn their sights to young children, whose virginity is more likely. Once this heterogeneity is reached, the omnipresent and ramified means of influence will meet no resistance, subjugating the will of individuals through the progressive dissipation of even access to the source of information, thus dispelling the hopes of awareness and discernment that already many philosophers and scientists have addressed to the future. Further exacerbating this climax are the biological effects that the scenario described makes explicit. With digital platforms specifically designed to maximize usage time, human attention capacity is progressively fragmented and therefore gradually restricted. To fully grasp the consequences of these restrictions, I resort to science and to what a naivety to neuropsychology inevitably overlooks. Attention is a superior cognitive function, responsible for a complex, multidimensional intertwining, whose ultimate purpose is the administration of the entire set of human cognitive functions. To infringe upon it means to erode the management of each individual's goals, intentions, and external stimuli, their very ability to learn and to elicit the saliences on which memories are formed. Scattered among the fragments of attention, one encounters the human perception of time, and with it, the promises of beauty and inspirations that throughout the history of civilization, the patience of artistic detail, and all cultural contemplations have made eternal. Devoid of these promises, the very value of life is vilified on a global scale that includes both the sparse minorities, creators of harmony, and those communities, as populous as they are remote from the vision of power, where debtors compare the value of a loan with the cost of murdering the creditor. The likelihood of an imbalance ensues where the growing clamor of an impoverished humanity is such as to inhibit the subdued manifestation of human civil values, where the silence created by passers-by in the days preceding Giuseppe Verdi's death is overwhelmed, who under the window where he lied threw bundles of straw to muffle the noise of the carriages. It is a natural fact for anyone faced with projections of a sometimes harsh realism to reject its validity, to defend themselves against it in the name of a more consoling, sugar-coated vision of their own existence. It is indeed in overcoming this defense that the progress of humanity germinates, and it is to this that I direct in all its exhortative power the clarity of a scenario in which influence manifests itself in the irrational levers of individuals and systems, and insinuates itself capillarily into the recesses of an unarmed behavior, with an impetuousness made incremental by the alliance between computer technology and neuroscience. we stand at a turning point. With knowledge of behavior mobilized in a massive action capable of influencing the will and free will of individuals, with an effectiveness unmatched in the entire history of humankind, the very concept of a just society achievable only through respect for and promotion of the dignity of every person is afflicted. Each of us, the elite of merits and power, has the ethical burden of a compensatory action for human dignity that is equally effective, that is suitable for guaranteeing all people an ever greater and ever lesser awareness of themselves, a sovereign knowledge of their vocations, and the freedom to fulfill them spontaneously. From this guarantee, the technological progress must not be detached, inevitable and relentless, among the highest expressions of extraordinary human cognitive potential. Any action aimed at its weakening would constitute a surrender to senseless anachronism, whose merit would be reduced to merely invigorating the inertia of retrospective romanticism. Thus, the most evolved and at the same time dignified human condition is encountered inherent into the convergence between technological progress and the action guarantor of free will. At one time, alphabetization was counted among the foundations of individual dignity, the driving force behind cognition and expressions of will, while the absence of its guarantee became an icon of civil backwardness in societies, an expression of the inability of states to protect their citizens socially. Today, the extent and ramified development of the interference of the means of influence exposes the impotence of a new milestone in the long journey of achievements of the social protection of dignity. To the understandings of power imbued with the same spirit that has enlightened civilizations to judge human beings as an end and never as a means, the culture reform the paradigms of global knowledge is reviewed. That is, to elevate the minimum thresholds of knowledge so that each individual is delivered a new dimension of awareness about their own behavior and the dynamics of influence to which they are susceptible. This elevation encounters a source of formidable expertise in the purest purposes of neuroscientific research, the capillary dissemination of which will present each individual with new ways of acting on their own cognition, maximizing the behavioral potential and with it their ability to shield themselves from the most intrusive insinuations of influence, guiding individuals towards the cardinal points of a new cognitive autonomy and a discernment capable of dispelling the obscurantism caused by the dissipation of information sources, already guilty in the past of having handcuffed the meaning of erring to the term error. The understandings of power are also entrusted with the ethical measure of the quantum of knowledge to be delivered to the multitudes, weighing it within the strategic perspicacity of a universally advantageous and in certain contexts counterintuitive vision. A population educated in the skills of influence will encounter in the set of deterrents that follow from them a lowering of the perception of risk to which it is subject. The same perception of risk that constitutes the failure of most business dynamics and whose least costly resolution is the strategic leveling of information asymmetries. The same perception of risk experienced by the illiterate person faced with an employment contract. The same perception that incites men to rebellion and insurrection. Pervaded by the immense privilege of having been able to express them, I offer each of you my ideas so that they may be catalysts for dialogue and creators of the new, here and now. With them, I also offer all the substance that the sapere aude, dare to know, leitmotif of my most intense studies has spurred me to embrace all the sophistication that my family heritage has donated to me through the zealous and tireless effort of approximating human beauty, all the perceptions and the pragmatisms that years of exercise of power have bestowed upon me. The exaltation, already implicit in the entity of the contingencies expressed, is aimed at the impellence of transforming these reasonings into practical action, and as such action constitutes a new victory for human dignity. So that in this grain of sand thrown at the exorbitant speed into outer space, no human being may be dormant in their most surprising potential, so that this potential may always be incited in the wonder of a magnesium bar burning in water, even when a screen claims otherwise. Today, in the place that more than any other brings together global power and dialogue, I wish to express my sincere gratitude to all of you, distinguished guests, for the attention you wished to dedicate to my words. I also extend my gratitude to Davos Lodge for welcoming me among the leaders and shapers of the global agenda. Lastly, I wish to thank Dr. Vantaraki for placing my ideas at the service of pragmatisms that are as foresighted as human progress. Thank you very much.